Well, thanks for joining, everybody. So this is the next in our regular series of security synopsis conversations. So just to remind everybody the house rules, what we try and do is get a bunch of interesting speakers. Hopefully you can learn stuff that you've not heard before about the topic of cybersecurity. We're all very trusted advisor. Today, really special event. We've got Director of NCSE, Chris Ensor, who I think I've known for too many years than either of us would care to recall. But yeah, I think we've all aged nicely during the period, Chris. I like to think. But
yeah, me too. I think you might have just promoted me. I think I'm actually deputy director. I'd like Levy's job. I'd like Levy's job. I'm not going for it.
There you go. Thank God we're not recording this, eh? It's only a matter of time, Chris, I'm sure. Anyway, it's a special treat, especially for the Node4 audience, to get somebody of your rank, the executive of NCSE, to join us. So Chris, as well as being one of the founding fathers of the Cyber First program, which we spoke about before, is also the owner of the Cyber Essentials program. So we're going to talk about that a wee bit more. Also, to make another introduction, so James is with us from our Edinburgh office. So I think for most of the audience out there, you either know James or me or both of us, and if you don't, then I'm sure you will pretty soon. So James is I can only describe as one of Node4's long-established security ninjas. So hopefully we're able to add a bit more context to the conversation. So this is really all about the audience. It's a unique opportunity to ask Chris some questions. Chris wants to myth bust, because I think that's really hard for me to say, by the way. I think there are some myths around Cyber Essentials, so we get to go straight to the root and knock some of those out. So please think of your questions. Ask questions in the chat as we go, because we can't unmute you, and because it's recorded, it just makes it easier. I'll try and get as many questions as we can over to Chris. So with no more ado, let's kick off with, well, first question is going to be from me. We'll warm Chris up with a few questions just to hit the subject. So Chris, I forget how many years Cyber Essentials has been running, but like most things, it's kind of picked up pace and gone through a bit of a hockey stick curve. And certainly of all the Node4 customers I speak to, Cyber Essentials pops up every other day or every other conversation. So I feel like it's come of age, it's hit its maturity point. But do you just want to give us a couple of sentences on the history and the intent, really?
A couple of sentences. Oh, I could do more than that.
Maybe
so I'm going to take you back to Olympic year 2012. Because NCS, well, it was CSG in those days, and kind of GCHQ launched something called the 10 Steps to Cybersecurity, which was kind of a high level, our high level view of what organizations should be doing to kind of manage their cyber risk. And that kind of came about because organizations, particularly the FTSE, had been talking to Director GCHQ at the time, was Ian Lobban, saying, GCHQ, you know about this stuff, you should be telling us what to do. What is it that we need to do to make ourselves cyber resilient? So I was involved in developing the 10 steps, and we got that out the door. And actually, after we got it out the door, then people would come to us and say, well, it's very good. We love the 10 steps. There's 10 of them. And, actually underneath the 10, there's like 70 odd controls. What is it you actually want us to do? What is it that you want us to put in place to make ourselves secure? And that kind of came in parallel with something else that was going on. So a number of large organizations in a particular sector that I won't mention got hit by quite a sophisticated threat actor. And we got involved in the investigations. And what we found was, even though the threat actor was sophisticated, they kind of walked in. They hadn't used any sophisticated techniques, because basically the doors were open. So, why use sophisticated techniques if you can just turn the handle? So we kind of brought those two things together, and we did a bit of work at the time to try and identify what a good standard that was kind of a basic standard that organizations could implement that would improve their security. And when we'd written the 10 steps, I kind of wanted to write and go implement something like 27,000 and everything will be good. But we couldn't bring ourselves to do that. Maybe we'll have a little chat about that. We'll come on to that in a little bit. But we thought to ourselves, what standards should we do? So we did a bit of work to try and see what standards were out there and what would industry support. So we ran a little bit of a competition, really. But we didn't get one answer. We got several answers, and none of them really hit the nail on the head. When you actually looked at how these organizations had been attacked, and then you looked at the standards, you kind of go, but if I implement that standard, it doesn't stop that organization being attacked, which is a bit of a, that in itself is a bit of an issue. We've got these standards out there, but are they actually doing what we think they're doing? So we ended up kind of looking at all the input we got from industry and kind of put and sort of went, let's come up with something that's a minimum set. And I'm becoming, I'm starting to have a mantra that'll end up on my gravestone, I suspect, which is less is more. So if you're in the security community and you haven't got a specific problem, right, it's quite easy to put more and more controls in, because, you know, you don't get sacked for putting more and more controls in, or, you know, because you know, they're always, and none of them are bad, you know, bad things, and all of them are useful. But we wanted to take a slightly different approach, and we kind of went, look, if you've only got a certain amount of effort and a certain amount of resource, what are the things you can do that really, really make you safe and make a tangible difference? And of course, we went back to the attacks we'd seen and kind of went, so if these have had certain things in place, would they have stopped the attack, or would they have made it a lot harder? So we narrowed it down to 5 things that organizations do, and they effectively became the Cyber Essentials controls. And you know, we fought quite hard to maintain a small number. And even today, people will say, well, why isn't backups one of those controls? And you kind of say, well, actually, if you do these controls well and consistently, it will reduce the likelihood you'll be attacked in the first place. So backups are good, absolutely. But if I included them, it would mean every organization, in order to get Cyber Essentials, would have to have backups. And ultimately, it should be a risk decision on behalf of those organizations. So we've been quite strict in trying to ensure that the controls we include were always going to be sort of tangible. And the last thing I'll say is, that's great, and we could have just left it as that. Here's a standard, bit like the 10 steps. You know, here's a standard, here's some guidance. Go use it, go implement it. But we went another step further, because there was a kind of urge. We needed a badge. You know, people wanted to be able to demonstrate to others that they met the 5 controls. So then, you know, we put effectively a trust regime around it, an assurance regime, where you could find trusted companies that could actually do that assessment, and you don't get that in many other standards in the same kind of way. So it's not only a standard that says minimum, but there's also a way you can demonstrate it. You can demonstrate it through going to trusted companies. So that's kind of where it started. Last year we saw the 100,000th certificate issued. Every year around 30,000 certificates get issued. So you're absolutely right. It is growing, and we've certainly seen the move from, I'm doing this because I have to do it because my, you know, I need a contract on it. We've seen it move from that to, I'm doing it because actually I want to improve my cybersecurity. There's so much ransomware going on, you know, and this is an effective mitigation against a lot of the ransomware attacks, you see. I'll shut up now and hand you back.
No, perfect. And in fact, you've stolen my thunder for the next question, because I was going to say that I always used to be used to people saying you needed Cyber Essentials if you wanted to sell to government. So it's a great way for UK government to persuade UK PLC to effectively pull itself up by the bootstraps. But I was going to say, whenever somebody asks us for a penetration test, my first question is, but have you actually done Cyber Essentials? Because as we all know, penetration test is just a snapshot in time. So it sounds like that message is getting there. So, I mean, when I always say to people, originally ISO 9000 was mandated by government, and now if you don't have ISO 9000, you're probably a taxi company or a chip shop. ISO 27001, I don't think everybody's going to have that, but you know, can we put you on the spot and say, when do you think it'll be that popular? When will 80% of businesses just have Cyber Essentials, regardless of who they sell to?
So I mean, that's our aim. You know, if you look at the cybersecurity, you know, the national cyber strategy, it's all about the resilience of the UK, and we can make the UK more resilient if everybody does the basic puts in place these basic controls. And we've got, you know, we're now getting some good data that, you know, if you put the controls in, you're something like 60% less likely to be affected by ransomware, because, you know, a lot of ransomware exploits the vulnerabilities that these controls fix, or, you know, to close off. So it's a really tangible way of doing it. And the other thing I think is where we've seen it used is, so when COVID hit, if you go back a couple of years, we were really concerned about the suppliers of critical healthcare, so pharmacies, homes, places like that, and so we wanted to find a way where we could, you know, the last thing they wanted is to have their IT taken down in the middle of COVID. So we came up with this idea, and we worked with Cabinet Office, and we got some funding to basically do targeted interventions, as we called them. So this was the idea of basically giving free support to those organizations to improve their security. And so we used the CyberSecurity, the Cyber Essentials network to go and help them. So people could come forward who were in those sectors, who met the criteria, and they would get support from one of the local companies that offered Cyber Essentials. And it wasn't necessarily about getting the badge, although that would have been a nice to have. But for some organizations, if they've got old IT, there are certain things that they have that, they just have the ability to upgrade and all this kind of thing. But what it gave them was a pathway to improve their security. And ultimately, the nirvana is they get a certificate at the end of it. But as long as they started to take steps, and these organizations didn't have a cybersecurity expert. That's not what they do. That's not what their business is. So, like a business that buys in a lawyer or an accountant, this was a bit like going out and buying in, but although they got it for free because that was the intervention, they got support from cybersecurity specialists who helped to take them through the guide, basically the standard, because they couldn't do it themselves. And many of them did achieve a certificate. And those that didn't, the feedback we got was having the conversation in the organization with the experts that came in actually helped them understand what they had to do, and many of them are on that path now. So
you get to know what you don't know, which is the stimulus of the conversation, is it? Otherwise you could just be in blind ignorance. I mean, actually, and sorry to jump in, that leads to a nice question. We've seen a few government procurements that talk about mandating Cyber Essentials Plus, and again, there's a load of organizations who've done Cyber Essentials. Obviously, Plus is just external verification of Cyber Essentials. I mean, you can't obviously speak on behalf of all of UK government, but a lot of people, and I would say, if you've got Cyber Essentials and you've committed to do Plus, it's going to be a matter of time till you get through that, probably a month maybe. Is that good enough from a procurement point of view, especially if you've already got ISO 27000, NIST, and all those kind of things? How do you think your colleagues in government would view that, and do they actually call you up and ask that as a question?
So I mean, so it all comes down to the procurement. The use of Cyber Essentials in procurement comes down to the policy procurement notice 1409 or something like that, and that drives everything that happens within government procurement. Ultimately, though, departments can add more to it. So Cyber Essentials Plus effectively gives you more confidence that you've done the controls, because at the lowest level, it's I assert I've done them, and that kind of assertion's audited. So you'd be surprised how many organizations don't often know what they've done within their systems. So they're asserting in good faith, but actually, some of those things aren't actually happening. I always tell the story of, go to an organization and you say, do you patch? Do you keep your system patched? And they say, yeah, we keep our system patched. How do you know? And they say, well, we have this policy. And they show me a lovely policy. And I go, oh, it's a lovely policy, lovely font, lovely setup, but do you patch? And they think I'm mad then, because, they've just shown me the policy that tells them they patch. And I said, well, but how do you know the policy's been implemented actually on the ground? And at that point, the penny drops, that they kind of go, oh, okay. And I think that's the next stage. When you go to that CE plus, you're getting that extra confidence. And ultimately, it comes down to I'd say to all organizations, plus is better, because you're going for that extra level of confidence. But it's down to the risk, and it's down to the people when they're procuring. You talk about procurement, when they're procuring services. If the risk of a cyber attack on their supplier or through their supplier is important to them, then they need that next level of confidence. But I think there's quite a bit of confusion, I think, around the use of Cyber Essentials. I mean, my analogy is what we've built with Cyber Essentials is a screwdriver, and people are picking the screwdriver up because actually, when they look in their security box of their toolkit, there's only a screwdriver in there, and they're picking it up and they're trying to hammer nails in with it, and they're trying to screw things with it, and it's not quite working because it wasn't built to do those things. And that's the thing with Cyber Essentials. In the one hand, it's become really popular, which is great. But on the other hand, some of that's having a little bit of perverse outcome when it's been applied to the wrong things. Yeah. So applying it to an organization systems, if I give you a contract and I say to you, I care about my contract, I want you to keep it safe for me. So on the system that you put it on and all the communications between us, I want to make sure that's got Cyber Essentials. But if the contract is for some IT, I'm going to buy some, I don't know, routers off you, or I'm going to buy some handsets off you, then it's no good trying to apply Cyber Essentials to the thing that's being delivered. So there's a bit of confusion, and to be fair to the community, the procurement people are procurement experts. They are not cybersecurity experts. And so for them, they found a tool, they think, oh, this is great. I really care about cybersecurity. I really want to improve cybersecurity. So I'm going to use the tool. But what we're finding is it's being used in slightly odd places because people are trying to do the right things.
It's like overprescribing antibiotics to a certain extent. I think just to dive in that a bit more, and I think that applies to organizations like ourselves, and there's some other IT organizations on the call that we were debating this internally only last week, that for me, Cyber Essentials applies to our office equipment. But if we deliver a cloud platform to somebody else, that cloud platform is part of somebody else's Cyber Essentials certification, of which we clearly need to be a part and help them with it. But it's almost knowing those boundaries. So again, with the antibiotics analogy, you can try and inoculate everything, and you realize you're just using the wrong medicine at the wrong time. Is that a fair metaphor?
Yeah, that's a really good one. But it's good that it's being used. But it does have these kind of edge cases and perverse consequences. So if you're trying to apply it to, I want to buy a telecom system, there's a completely different set of security requirements that are needed. It's not to say that you don't patch things and you don't do a lot of those things, but you do them in a slightly different way. And there are other maybe more appropriate requirements that you should be going for. So if you take cloud, we've got the cloud principles on the NCSC website, and G Cloud, goes against those. So that doesn't, that's where you have to have security requirements that are appropriate to the thing that's being delivered. And I go back to the origins of Cyber Essentials. It was based around sort of enterprise corporate systems. Don't try to apply it to an energy system. You might want to apply it to the billing system, the billing system that an energy provider has, but not the energy system itself. But it's very subtle. I mean, that security all over. My most common answer I give to somebody is it depends, because it'll depend on the circumstance, the context, the risk appetite, all those kind of things, the threat actors. That is the sort of thing. So trying to come up with a single silver bullet that solves everybody's problems is really hard. And I think that's where Cyber Essentials is being seen more and more as that silver bullet. And it is, but in the right circumstances.
And I think, if I may, and I don't want to twist on this procurement thing so often, I think there are government departments, particularly the smaller ones, who say you just have to have Cyber Essentials. That cascades down the tree, lands with suppliers, and they just try and put it everywhere. So it's good to hear that, to maybe potentially be able to grow you in the right circumstances. I mean,
so it's worth saying, Andy. So so we're doing a couple of pieces. They're doing a couple of pieces of work there to try and sort of resolve that. So one, we're working with the Cabinet Office on the procurement notice. To clarify it, to make to ensure that it's used properly. We're working with the Government Security Group because they care about government supply chain. So when it comes to additional requirements, where Cyber Essentials doesn't fit, well, what is it that does fit? And so what do we put in there? And the other thing I do on a case-by-case basis where I can is where I hear about things being applied in the wrong way. I kind of offer, got to be careful what I say here, but I kind of offer to go and try and find the procurement people who are asking for it, to try and work out what they're trying. I mean, sometimes it's a legitimate reason they're using it for, but sometimes, so I'll have that conversation. So we've done that. We're working quite closely with universities at the moment. So universities, as you can imagine, are strange beasts, who, their student population have all got their own devices. So trying to get Cyber Essentials when you have no control over your endpoints, or many of your endpoints, is really quite hard. So then how do you manage that?
Well, one of the questions somebody sent me before the session was exactly on BYOD. So shall we go for BYOD, otherwise known as bring your own device now? So yeah. What's the word from the Oracle? Is it bad? Is it good?
So we haven't.
Say it depends.
Well, it does depend. So we haven't changed anything in Cyber. So this is an interesting thing. So we did some changes last year to Cyber Essential. We've come into a yearly cycle now of making changes. The world changes, and we need to make sure that it's appropriate. And what we ended up doing was Well, a couple of things. Let me step back a little bit. So a couple of things have happened over the last couple of years. So the first thing is that when we began, we had 5 bodies that were kind of managing the program. So, you know, I talked about this community of trusted certification bodies. But when we started, there were 5, we called them accreditation bodies, but they were kind of overseeing bodies. I don't like to use the word accreditation because somebody tells me off, but they were kind of overseeing bodies, and they looked after groups of these certification bodies. And we did that for very good reason, you know, which was having more bodies in that space brought in innovation and kind of competition and all the things that were good. What we found was actually what it brought was confusion, inconsistency, and all those kind of things. So a couple of years ago, we moved to a single partner who was IASME. And at the same time, we did some clarifications around the guidance, which included some stuff around BYOD. Those two things combined meant that some organizations then started to struggle. And the reason they started to struggle was what we weren't aware of, and the reason that we went to one body like IASME was that they were interpreting Cyber Essentials in different ways. And so some were interpreting it in a risk managed way. So they would say, even though you can't patch any of these devices because they're BYOD, we think you're doing other stuff that's good enough, and therefore you can have your certificate. The problem is the system was never designed to be like that. You know, Cyber Essentials was designed to be quite binary. And the reason we designed it to be quite binary was because we needed to keep the costs down and the expertise of the assessors to be able to make quite complex risk judgments on controls and how you trade controls and things like that. So the fact that we'd found out that people were actually giving certificates out on risk judgments that we had no sight of meant that we needed to bring some consistency to it. And bringing that consistency meant that some people who'd previously may have got through with, you know, BYOD were no longer getting through. But I mean, it comes back to security, isn't it? This is about putting in place controls to stop commodity attacks, that, you know, the publicly available tools and techniques that are out there. And the first thing, you know, the end user device is the you know, we used to say the firewall at the, you know, that connected your organization to the world was your, you know, your protection, was your gateway, was your portcullis. But now, you know, every device connects to the internet, you know, and it doesn't all go through, apart from, you know, certain organizations that, you know, VPN back into the main organization and out through a big, you know, through a main firewall. Most organizations don't do that, and you know, all their devices will go into the corporate, out to the internet, all over the place. So as a result of that, that device is a gateway to your system, and if you have no control over it, then that is quite a significant risk factor in you know, how you're securing your network. So for us, you know, if you can manage those devices within the corporate system, so it doesn't stop people bringing them, but there's an element of, you know, the organization has to know what's connecting, you know, and the state of the things that are connecting, because ultimately, you know, they're sharing their data with these devices. But that for some organizations can be tricky. If you take a university where students bring in devices, and, you know, that is very hard to do. And so what we you know, we continually look at this problem, you know, because people come back and say, well, we've got this technology and that should fix it, and we kind of get, but we can't look at that technology, you know, because it's you know, we're making trade-offs, because once you've, you know, if you've got an end device that's been patched and you know, and you're not running as admin and you're running anti-malware on it, you know, it's in a good state, you're pretty confident that it will protect you and it will withstand those kind of attacks. The minute you don't know that, then the alternatives you have to put in to prevent, either to spot that something's on that device or that something's moving from that device into your network, is quite sophisticated. You know, you're having to monitor, you have to make sure that the system that's monitoring actually reacts to the things that are happening, and then you can do something about it. So it gets complicated.
And sorry to jump in, so bizarrely,
No.
BYOD almost introduces the SOC conversation, doesn't it? You can either have a simple portcullis mentality, and as soon as you make it grey, you've got to apply a lot more intelligence into that, which is brilliant. I know James has got a question come in about MFA, but we've also got a question from the floor, so which I think nicely touches on it. So can we use CE, Cyber Essentials, as a hammer, not a screwdriver, to disassemble shadow IT? I think I would rephrase that more as Yeah, what are your thoughts on shadow IT? And actually, I had a question from elsewhere that said lots of people have gone to cloud, and you've touched on it nicely. I mean, apart from James, we're all in home offices today, which is the very much post-COVID world, and we're all connected to the internet, often natively. But yeah, talk to us about shadow IT and Cyber Essentials, and has moving to cloud and pure internet made Cyber Essentials easier, harder, or different?
So no difficult questions there at all then. Shadow IT has been interesting. So some of the feedback we get, I mean, I get a lot of feedback, as you can imagine, but it's good. You know, I like to understand how this stuff hits the streets and how people are using it and how people interpret it. And a lot of IT, you know, administrators have actually said the fact that we've had to get Cyber Essentials has actually been beneficial for them, because they've been able to use it as an argument for actually taking back some control of shadow IT and actually understanding what their system looks like. So I've had quite a few people saying, even though it was really, really hard achieving it, it's actually, A, I've been able to get investment, and B, it enabled me to get rid of things I was really worried about that I had no control over. So it's actually, you know, it's quite an interesting forcing function. You know, if you go back to when we started and we created the standard, you know, here's the 5 control, do them. I would have been in many ways happy at that point, because as long as people had a conversation around it. But of course, voluntary conversations don't happen.
No, you've got your trousers on fire with busy things to do, and you never get around to it.
Yeah.
Why
So
mandation and forcing function is needed, isn't it?
and that's exactly, and that's it, and that made the conversations happen. And so I think that's been really beneficial to a lot of organizations. You know, they, you know, on the one hand they say it was really hard, and you know, they in one breath they hate it because of it's really, you know, it was really hard for them given where they were starting from. But they were really happy at the end because they brought everything under some sort of, you know, they had confidence now in what they had, whereas before they didn't. And they, you know, they tell their management, you know, we need to invest in this, we need, you know, we can't have all this legacy IT, you know, this stuff going on over there. But then they had the reason to change it. So, you know, that was the benefit of it.
And I like that. I think, as you know, I'm a great believer in using security as a sell technique as well as just the right thing to do, and helping people to motivate businesses. But you're right. I think one of the challenges of the IT director today is shadow IT. So if this is a way of selling to the IT director, that Cyber Essentials is a good way of getting that awareness, that control. It's almost like having a knife amnesty, isn't it? Where you have a shadow IT amnesty. I guess the other thing I take from that is I've heard a few people go, well, shadow IT, I'm just using a website, so it's okay. I don't need to tell security. But actually, how do you know where the website is? Where does your data go? And all those kind of important forcing function questions. So I think probably everybody said too much from me. So James, I know you had a question that had come in live from a customer the other day, all about authenticator app. So do you want to go for it?
Yeah, well, maybe I've asked two questions quickly. One just around Chris, what do you think? You know, there's always been historically Windows Firewall, for example, on an end user device has always been turned off by administrators, and I know that within the 2022 Cyber Essentials, there's a requirement to make sure that is on for home workers and so on. So what's the importance of that? How do you see that moving? Being pushed out to users, and the importance of it for home users that are using their own laptop.
I think of home users as small organizations at the end of the day. You know, somebody using a laptop, I mean, it comes down to, you know, what I said earlier, that unless you're pumping everything, you know, you've got a single connection, you're pumping everything back through your organization and out through an organizational firewall. Every device is its own little system, and therefore every device almost, you know, has to meet the same requirements as Cyber Essentials. So having the firewall, you know, on and properly configured for the things that the organization really needs that laptop, you know, that device to be able to do is really important. And I think what we've seen over the years is, you know, the security of devices has become a lot better. You know, out of the box now, they are a lot more secure than they ever were. So, you know, the fact that you've got a firewall on there, and you've got a lot of good anti-malware built by the vendor of the device, you know, the software, the device, who knows their device better than anybody else a lot of the time. There's a lot of good stuff on there, and it brings down the costs because you're not having to necessarily bring in other software. So for me, you know, the fact, you know, it's this thing that there aren't any boundaries anymore. Well, there are boundaries, but they sit in everybody's laptop or phone that connects to the corporate system, and therefore each of those is a gateway, and therefore you have to treat it as such. So that's where I am on that.
Cool, thanks. That was the easy question. So maybe I was just warming you up there to the harder question of. Obviously, we've seen quite a few attacks recently that have centered around MFA fatigue, multi-factor fatigue, and we're seeing new authentication methods come out there. You know, Windows Hello, FIDO2, and then I were just discussing. You know, is that's still multi-factor, isn't it? Moving to those authentication systems, and do you see Cyber Essentials moving towards that sort of, or pushing people towards that, or how do you see that moving forward for authentication?
I mean, we continue to review where the technology is going and bring it in. I think the key thing, I mean, what you always have to think of, what I can always think about is, you know, at the end of the day, what Cyber Essentials is aimed at is kind of publicly known tools and techniques. You know, we're not trying to. It doesn't counter a more sophisticated resourced actor, but it'll make them work a lot harder. So when you see stories about, you know, MFA being, you know, intercepted or whatever, it does happen, but it's not all the time and for everybody. So having multi-factor authentication is still really an effective way of keeping your critical accounts safe. So, you know, so I wouldn't say, oh no, stop using because there's been these a few incidents. So it does make people work a lot harder because they've got to do a secondary element to the attack, which is you've got to go after your MFA credentials. So, you know, but we will always continue to look at the techniques. I mean, from an NCSC perspective, you know, our aim is passwords go, and there are other better forms of authentication that people can use. It should be, you know, our dream is we make it a lot easier for people to do security. In fact, they shouldn't have to do security because it's done for them, and they have to do the minimum. I mean, they always have to do something, like, you know, you still have to unlock your car or whatever, but it's all done for them, and that's the place we want to take technology. Is that it makes it a lot easier, and we will continue to revise and you know, and change Cyber Essentials as the technology comes along to be able to do that.
So I think the point we get from that is, provided the organization is using new technology, and I guess proven new technology, to improve security and ultimately make it easier for the users, then that's obviously a good thing. And you're not going to prescribe technology, which one of the myths I often get is somebody said to me, Cyber Essentials says I have to have an Active Directory firewall. I'm like, the government are never going to tell you what you should do. They're going to suggest how you should do it.
Yeah.
But that leads nicely into, well, I think nicely into some of the other questions. We're getting loads of questions from the floor now. A lot around ISO 27001, which I was also going to ask if we didn't get any questions. So really the big debate going on the floor here is ISO 27001 higher than Cyber Essentials? I think that could be a quick one. But I think more importantly, the question's going, would government procurement say you've got ISO 27001, therefore you're good to go as far as the Cyber Essentials compliancy goes?
It depends, right?
Yes.
So let's look at what they both offer you, right? So if you take Cyber Essentials, it's based around a particular threat model, which is somebody attacking you from the internet using commodity tools and techniques. So the controls are geared to mitigate that risk. So it specifically says there should be these 5 controls. They shall be looked, you know, I'm cartooning a little bit. They shall be looked at by an independent person, and you're good to go. So that's Cyber Essentials. Let's take 27,000. So 27,000 is basically information risk management system. So it basically says you have to have one. It doesn't say what risks you manage. So it doesn't say specifically that you have to manage the risk of an attack from the internet, you know, with using commodity tools and techniques. It's for the organization to choose which risks they decide to manage. So if you come along with a 27,000 certificate, that's a start, maybe, but then you have to go, okay, now let me drill down into this. So what was assessed? You know, what are you actually doing? How are you actually patching everything? And then you have to look at, so what was the credentials of the person who did the 27,000 assessment? You know, were they able to say whether you've done those controls? So this is the problem. I think I think my best analogy, I like a good analogy, so this isn't a good one, but I'll do my best, right? So when you go to a restaurant, right, when you choose a restaurant, you get the food hygiene certificate, right, on the door, which tells you that you've got a good chance of not being food poisoned because they take food hygiene very seriously. That depends what the rating is, I suppose. But it doesn't actually tell you about what food you're going to get or the quality of the food you're going to get. And I think there's something around 27,000 is, you know, and somebody's going to shoot me for this, but, you know, there's an element of it tells you something about the organization in terms of it is looking, you know, it takes security, it does take security seriously, but it doesn't actually tell you what it takes seriously. What is the risk that it is managing within the organization? And I think that's the important difference. So, you know, is one higher than the other? Well, I know with Cyber Essentials that if you've got a certificate, you are managing a particular risk. And I don't need to do any more work because that's been done for me by people who are competent to do it. If you give me a 27,000 certificate, I have to do more work. I have to go and find out whether actually you are managing it. And I have to have the skills to do that. So that's kind of the difference. It's not that it's you know, it gives you different things at the end of the day.
And I guess at the risk of turning your metaphor into a meta 5, you can rock in up to a Michelin star restaurant. It doesn't mean they're good at hygiene. Whereas a Michelin star restaurant with a 5-star in terms of hygiene is what you look for. And I think an interesting bit of advice I'll give to people, loads of CISOs talk about the supply chain, but they never remember the fact that they're actually also a supplier to someone else. So I think the one bit of the many bits you said there, but one thing I want to really hold on to is, you said making it easy for someone. So if you've got ISO and people have to ask you loads of questions, they're probably going to go to the next person who's got ISO and Cyber Essentials because it's just easier. From a procurement point of view, you've now answered the first 9 mandatory questions. Let's talk about the actual solution, the product, the whatever. So it's that kind of table stakes, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the other thing I'd observe is kind of when we see organizations being hit, they often have 27,000.
Yeah,
they've still been hit, and so, you know, this is why we, you know, it comes back to less is more. You know, 27,000, you can do an awful lot in 27,000. In Cyber Essentials, it's a lot less. Still quite hard, but, you know, it's very focused, and that's kind of where we went.
And I think it's the internal battle that, and it's useful to hear you say that, because certainly both James and I have taken a number of organizations through Cyber Essentials. In my case, one of the world's biggest organizations. I think I had 15 meetings, all of which said, we're ISO 27001. Why do we need to do this thing? And at the end, the answer was, well, do you want to lose all of our government contracts? You know, because so hearing that logic is useful to get through. I guess sticking with the theme, and this is an interesting question, which I feel like I should answer, but I'm super interested in your view. So it kind of says an MSP offering CE related services has to be careful advertising a product as compliant. And I think what we're driving at here is, like, let's take Node4 as an example. Just because we've got Cyber Essentials doesn't mean that all of our products, in fact, we can't say our products are Cyber Essentials compliant. We've kind of touched on this. So if we were selling our cloud product to a customer who's doing Cyber Essentials, we have to help them and they have to help themselves to be Cyber Essentials compliant, of which we're a component. So I think for me, the big myth there is, and I wonder if the person's seen anybody else doing this, if anybody else is out there selling a Cyber Essentials compliant product, this product will magically help you to be Cyber Essentials compliant, then that's a big myth, and they're probably a charlatan, would be where I think we'd go with that.
But it is a challenge because with a lot of the community haven't necessarily got the expertise to then make that judgment.
Yeah.
So and it comes back to that screwdriver. You know, Cyber Essentials. It must be good. It is Cyber Essentials. And then when it's the depends, but not necessarily have the expertise then to go and look at well, what is the security of the cloud offering that you're giving? And then you asked about cloud earlier, and is the use of cloud, you know, improvement? And I think again it depends, because cloud is very different. You know, how cloud architects itself is very different from how we used to architect physical systems. It's almost a different mindset. But I think sometimes there's a feeling that I've given my stuff over to the cloud, wherever that is, and it's going to be safe because they're going to look after it for me. But ultimately, it depends what you've bought and what the offer is. You know, if it's PaaS or SaaS or whatever, you know, there's going to be different responsibilities on you and the cloud provider. And it's understanding where they sit. You know, the cloud providers isn't going to decide, you know, what the access control policies are going to be on your buckets. that's for you to decide, because you know who you want to share with. So I think there's it's good. There's good things and bad things about how that goes in. But again, we keep evolving Cyber Essentials. Originally, we kind of excluded it, and then we've slowly brought it back in, because it's hard. Because if you're using a cloud provider, you need, how do you get the evidence from them that they're doing the things that you would have been doing if you were doing it on your own infrastructure.
And then a bizarre twist of is CE higher, equal, or less than ISO 27001, which we covered. I think my personal commentary would be, if I'm in an organization going for Cyber Essentials, I'm buying my cloud from a cloud company. Have they met the cloud security principles that you mentioned, which is a completely different but related set of guidance? Do they have ISO? Do they have the other big standards? So it's almost expecting your suppliers to have ISO and all the other sensible stuff to help you with your Cyber Essentials. So yeah, I think that nicely answers the one is not higher than the other. It also now brings me back to, I was going to ask you, what's next in the program for the next 3 years? Will there be a Cyber Essentials plus or Cyber Essentials squared, or and as you said, you've now got into an annual cycle, which is great. Yeah, where do we go next?
So yeah, we've got our cycle of updates, and we always try and do our updates based on sort of evidence. I mean, when Ian, when Ian Levy used to stand up and talk, well, he still stands up and talk, but not as the NCSC. It was all about, we should be evidence based. So again, we update the controls and the documentation based on what we see in the field. So that's ongoing. We've got a project running at the moment called Cyber Essentials Pathways, which is really quite interesting. So we know complex organizations struggle to get Cyber Essentials. And because, we go back to this procurement thing, ultimately a procurement person wants to see a certificate because it's hard to judge a load of evidence. So it's nice to have a certificate. So where people have brought in BYOD, or they've got more, they've got things in there that they might have legacy because of one reason or another, because of the nature of their business. The idea of Pathways is you can achieve a Cyber Essentials Plus certificate by meeting the outcome rather than the controls. I think this is not this is not an unusual thing. I think the banking sector have similar things where, depending on your maturity, effectively, you either just do the controls, or you're trusted to do other, more complex things. So Pathways is a much more, it'll basically test the outcome. So if you've got BYOD, I'll just give you an example. So if you've got BYOD, the idea would be that you have to assume that one of those devices is going to be done over because you've got no control over it. You don't know what patching level it is. So could you, as the organization, can you spot that something's on there that shouldn't be on there, or is trying to move about your network? And if you can spot it and stop it quickly, then that's good, and you could achieve a Cyber Essentials Plus. So we're running a pilot at the moment with about a dozen organizations to see if this can work. So it's a bit like attack simulation. So if you know about that, where you have a team and you kind of go, let's just get in there. What this will do, it'll be a very focused attack simulation based around, an attack coming from the internet using publicly available tools. So we've got that coming along because, and I'm hoping that'll be successful, but it's a bit of an experiment. I love a good experiment. Because,
and quick question, just on that one. I was about to say, I love a good experiment / pilot. So how do we /Node4 / any of our customers get involved in that? Because as you've gathered, we've 3,000 customers. We get in a lot of the edge cases, so today's been really useful. How do we work with you guys on that directly?
So we're full in terms of the pilot now. So we need to run it. We're hoping it'll complete just around the end of the financial year, so March time. We'll conclude from that either this was great and therefore we can now roll it. So we've got a way of doing it, because the pilot is kind of doing a couple of things. It's proving the concept, but it's also developing the artifacts and the sort of reporting and all that kind of thing that's coming out, which will enable us then to scale it. So come, I'll either be, there'll be a really successful blog on the NCSC website saying it's great and now open for business, or it'll be, well, we did it and these were the problems, and so we're gonna have to look at something else, while we continue to look at the procurement side of things and making sure that there's the procurement people are asking for the right things. So we've got that coming along. We've just announced Cyber Advisor, which is this idea of finding people and then organizations offering services that can help organizations implement. It goes back to, the NHS interventions we did. We want to do more of that, be able to do more of that, and we need confidence in that somebody can go in and actually help people do that configuration. It's not everybody you can do the assessment can necessarily help an organization do the implementation.
Yeah, big time. And that's where we need to, organizations like us need to delineate. So again, I guess we all have a good metaphor, if not a metaphor, don't we? So it's almost like today you've got driving examiners, but there isn't a license for the driving instructor. So as soon as we can get driving instructors and examiners, then you've got the full set.
Yeah, so that's another piece of work we're doing. That's just going live. We're doing more interventions, so we're selecting different sectors and providing targeted interventions into those sectors.
And can we draw you on which sectors are going to be?
You could, but I can't remember off the top of my head which ones it might be on our web. We might be on our website. It's been announced. It's public. It's not okay. Not secret. And finally, we're playing around with the idea of failure reports. So what's the rationale for that? So at the moment, it's a bit like you go through it, you either get a certificate or you don't get anything, right? Because you failed. You might get a report you use internally, but we are looking to see, can we create something that can be used externally? Because what we find is organizations will pass all 4 of the controls and then have problems with a 5th. But they may have done other things, and so you could potentially use the failure report as part of evidence that you've done 80%, and these are the things you're doing around the bit that you failed on, or these are the reasons why you failed, so that it could be used as part of evidence to a procurement or something like that. Because it is an independent check, we've had some interesting experiences with. Say schools, schools will because they've got a bit of BYOD in there because students bring their own devices. They've often got old IT. So, having this independent failure report is actually quite a good way of saying this is where we need to invest in to meet the needs.
So it's like consultancy to go back to the management to say, we're missing in this area here, because often trying to convince management.
That's exactly spot on. It's a bit of an experiment to see if we can use, but a customer, somebody who wants a Cyber Essentials certificate could then say, well, can I have a failure report? So I can then use this as my reason for investing. So that's kind of what it's intended for. So I think those are the main areas.
That's spot on. I think if I could have dreamt, what do we need for Cyber Essentials going forward? And I think the good thing about what you said there is I think people are expecting you to mandate technical things, like whether it be DMARC or PDNS, etc. It's very much procedural things. So I'm conscious of time, and you've got to rush to a donut-shaped, very secure building that shall remain nameless pretty soon once we get to 1 o'clock. James, was there any kind of closing thoughts from you? Because I know you get to see a bunch of customers and get to hear some of this drama. Was there one final quick question from you?
No, I think we've covered everything. Got a lot of really good information in there. So thanks very much, Chris. And yeah, looking forward to seeing what you're doing in the next wee while. Those sound like some really good improvements, actually.
Yeah, brilliant. And I guess final word to you before we hand over and then say what's going to be happening next. But this has been myth busting. Do you feel like there's one myth that we haven't busted on this tape, on this recording, on this session?
No, I think I've cut. Well, so there are still little things around things like the scope of Cyber Essentials. Does it have to be the whole organization and things like that? And actually, we've got some organizations that have got 4 or 5 certificates because they've divided up their system and the way they've architected it and got individual certificates. And that's perfectly legitimate. There's something in there that says if a device should be in scope if it's internet touchable. So if I can, if I'm sitting on the internet and I can get some code onto a device, then that's internet touchable. But you think there's things in the back end that don't touch the internet, but they go through other things like servers or whatever. And that's, I feel like, a too-hot process. So you have to get into something before you get into that. So of course that doesn't have to be in scope. I mean, the good thing to do it. There's no bad thing to have all your stuff kind of included. But at the end of the day, it's about managing specific risks within the organization and what are the risks you want to manage. So yeah, so those are kind of the things. Like I say, a lot of it is not people say, oh, you've made this change recently, and it's not. But with the way, because we're now doing this yearly change, people are rereading it and kind of going, oh, hang on, have you changed that? And a lot of it was there previously, or we might have just clarified it a bit. So those are I think those are the main things.
No, and I think that's the useful one. So a lot of people obsess about unpatchable software, but not wishing to pick on any one manufacturer, but the Linux box that's in the back room somewhere, that there is a multi-hop path from there to the internet, and it's not been patched since 1990 because it simply can't be. To me, from what you said and what we all know, that is passable of Cyber Essentials. Certainly, you should try and get it patched. You should try and throw it in the skip when you can make the business case. But I've heard so many people say everything has to be patched, and my media department have to use this particular bit of software which I can't patch on an ancient Mac. The world is doomed. The answer is the world isn't doomed. You put it somewhere behind enough layers to keep it away from the edge.
Yeah, we certainly see this in, we've seen this in the health sector where they've got quite legacy medical equipment.
X-ray machines are the classic one.
Yeah, and the thing for me is, well, what do something to keep it out of the way. If it is internet touchable because the manufacturer has to, manage it or download patches. Well, there are ways you can segment that off, and only the you can do things around that to ensure that it's only the manufacturer that gets access to it. But it does take that little bit more cybersecurity expertise to start thinking about how do you structure your network in a way that, because ultimately what we're trying to do is trying to protect organizations. And if you've got a device that connects to the internet that is old, it is going to be the reality is it is going to be a target, and just excluding it from the scope, or trying to just ignore it, is not going to help you. And so that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, exactly. And the inadvertent ransomware impact, I won't even call it attack, on the NHS proved exactly that. My wife's a nurse, and yes, looking at ransomware on an X-ray machine that you didn't think was connected to the internet is the reason why you should do this.
Yeah.
But I think I've seen a lot of people have a big sigh of relief on the call. So I think that was a good place to end. So I'm going to say, well, thanks again for your time, Chris. I know you've got to rush off to matters of state and national security, which is what the day job is, and I'm glad you're doing that kind of thing and not me. So thanks again for your time. That's been super useful. Good that we can get back to you on some of these questions, and keen to work with you going forward on the pilots and the pathways as discussed. So no, that was great. Thanks again, and thanks again everyone for tuning in. I guess I get to do my classic outro to say I think this has been for me the model of what this security synopsis is all about. Asking sensible questions of people who know what they're talking about, which is clearly Chris in this case, not me. And so please tune in on the third Thursday of every month at midday. I think that in the future series we're talking about domain takedown, which is a thing close to my heart, and using artificial intelligence. So it's about time the internet got cleaner. So we'll be touching on that as well as many other subjects going forward. But I think you all know, clearly everybody knows how to get to the webinar. So please stay tuned, I guess is the cheesy way of ending. But thanks again, everyone.